Silence reigned for what seemed to Cecilia like a neon. Glaciers could form and expire in the time, she thought. Whole galaxies far, far away, could spawn millions of stars and solar systems, and be wiped out slowly one by one. Eventually, Dumbledore spoke. He said. Firstly, I must say, you have given this a lot of thought, Cecilia. This is to be commended, and the fruit of your success as a team. He looked between Cecilia and Snape, smiling slightly. From what you have both said, concluded Dumbledore, that you are both in agreement with the plan, and you have considered the risks. He glanced at Cecilia. Then you should go ahead with it. Severus and I will secure samples of hair from the donors as before, and I will organize a member of the Order to accompany you, Cecilia. As I'm sure you understand, I cannot spare Severus from school, nor from the Order work he is undertaking. Cecilia nodded, knowingly. However, you will need to ask Harry's permission for his hair sample yourself, Cecilia. I cannot see that being a problem. Your work is proceeding with him well, I understand, and from the reports from the students themselves, Harry included, you are the best moral studies teacher they have ever had. Yes, Harry has certainly been most cooperative and patient, agreed Cecilia, trying not to let pride affect her. You must organize with Mr. Smith a mutually agreeable time for the work to be carried out, and once you have done this, you must inform the person from the Order who will accompany you. There is a meeting tonight at Grimmauld Place and I will raise this tonight for discussion. Or I will inform you who it will be. He smiled, looking over his spectacles, and half arose as if that concluded their meeting. There is one last thing, added Cecilia. Dumbledore sat back down and his smile melted away, to be replaced by seriousness. We will need one more sample other than that which we had before. Both Dumbledore and Snape were staring at her now. Continue, said Dumbledore. He remained seated, watching her intently. Before I say, I need to be sure. Are there no living relatives, other than his aunt on his mother's side? No, Cecilia. You're quite right. Petunia Dursley is Harry's only living blood relative, she and his cousin Dudley. That is the very reason that I placed Harry under Mrs. Dursley's protection as a child after his parents were murdered. Only she, as Lily Potter's sister, was able to afford the protection he needed as he was growing up. In that case, it is a DNA sample from her that we require. It does not need to be hair, it could be it could be blood saliva skin anything that would give us enough to analyze. That will not be a problem, said Dumbledore, and Cecilia thought he looked relieved. Then she realized why. He thought I was going to ask for something of Voldemort. Is that everything? Dumbledore got to his feet, smiling again as he did so. She nodded. In that case, I'm sure you both have much to prepare. I myself have an appointment with Hagrid, over a rather persistent crop of bindweed. He crossed the floor, showing both Cecilia and Snape towards the door. So persistent in fact it has bound his hut so tightly he's worried about Fang, who he tells me has been inside for 3 days and is convinced will die of starvation. He chuckled as he opened the door. Headmaster, said Snape, nodding in acknowledgement, and began to descend. Cecilia was just about to follow him when Dumbledore called her. She stepped back through the door. It is heartening when members of the Order, indeed any of our friends and allies who were once at odds coming to add mutual understanding. He paused, as Cecilia stood there. She could feel her jaw dropping, not knowing what to say. Dumbledore glanced over his shoulder as he made his way past Fawkes, tickling him lightly on the comb as he began to climb the stairs at the upper part of his office. She turned to go again. Oh, one last thing, he said, pausing slightly. Madame Pomfrey informs me that in her candid opinion the reason for the lethargy you will be experiencing over the next week or so will be due to the butterbeer. The yeast, you know. It has a particular effect on non-wizards. She assures me that you'll be right as rain by weekend. Good evening, he added, before Cecilia could say anything, then continued up the stairs. Yes, good evening, said Cecilia, turning to go down the stairs once more. I'd love to know how he does that, she thought as she made her way down towards the potions classroom. From his utmost window, Dumbledore watched as Cecilia walked swiftly out of the door and into the courtyard. 88,888,888. Cecilia was indeed tired that week. She'd taken it upon herself the next evening to visit Madame Pomfrey to find out about the butterbeer and was shocked when she explained to her that the yeast in butterbeer was almost parasitic in nature. It lived, explained Poppy, by feeding off the magic of the consumer in a symbiotic relationship until it had recouped that which had been given through the narcotic effects of the alcohol, leaving wizards with no lasting effects. In non-magical beings, since the magic was not available, they collected latent magic from the environment until the deficit was reached. As you're in Hogwarts, they should be content in no time, said Poppy, in what Cecilia assumed to be reassuring. You'll just feel more tired than usual this week while the yeast collects it. Once it has, nature will take its course. I thought it might have been something to do with the Veritaserum, said Cecilia, uneasy at the thought of the butterbeer yeast still being inside her. Not in the least. As I said a month ago, Mrs. Frobisher, you are extremely lucky to have no ill effects. The potion I gave you had no side effects. And you seem to be well. Now, how was it that you came to be drinking butterbeer? Cecilia went on to recall how Tunks had told her it would be okay for her to drink it, as Poppy tutted every so often, decrying Tunks's severe lack of judgment and Cecilia's own for being so easily led. Changing the subject, Cecilia then asked Poppy whether she was familiar with the term reciprocator with respect to Raymond Lully. She hoped that Poppy might be able to enlighten her, but the healer had shaken her head. She had offered for Cecilia to read through Pompops's notes again though, and said she would pursue the sigil writing with Professor Snobbits on her behalf. Teaching too was difficult. She had written to Nick almost immediately after the meeting with Dumbledore, and had agreed with Snape that they couldn't proceed until the weekend at the very least. Usually her mind was able to tick over as she taught, considering the latest problem or challenge, but now on hold, she had to wait. Cecilia hated waiting, but wait she must, and that, coupled with being unable to, and that many students had taken a less than positive attitude to their Mole Studies work, this made teaching extremely difficult. Admittedly there was a spectrum of attitudes, ranging from apathy in class to out-and-out refusal and cheeky comments, but the attitude of one or two was having a knock-on effect with the others. As she watched the second years reading Madame Cadwallader's Mole Studies books about the Falklands War, considering how it had come about, she thought back to her own teaching days and how difficult it had been to gain the control and respect necessary to direct young though often not so very keen minds. Shut 'em up and get it in 'em was the motto of her tutor at the time, and though this invariably worked with practice, it was increasingly difficult when some students here were making bold with cheeky comments, making a show of it in front of their friends. When it came to the 5th and 6th year classes though, the Weasley children as well as Harry and Hermione, rallied round, with scathing remarks aplenty for which Cecilia was grateful. However, she was having an entirely different problem with Ron. It was clear that her being a squib was not the problem, but whenever she tried to address him about his work, or asked him anything directly, whether in class or out of it, he would button up, quite refusing to speak to her. No, refusing wasn't the right word, she considered. His work was excellent, outstanding at times, she thought, but it was if he was lost for words. On Friday, when she had the 5th year's last again, she was again impressed by his ability to carry out the volumetric titration she had shown them, for determining the concentration of acids in foods. Not only had Ron managed to titrate his ethanoic acid with precision each time, when they'd carried out the calculation, his volume was the closest too. She was about to praise him for his work, but reconsidered. Whatever Ron's problem was, it wasn't going to be helped by addressing him in front of his classmates. Going to dismiss the class, and she considered her luck must be changing as no one had mentioned anything alluding to her being a squib. She asked whether anyone had any questions. It must have been the yeast having a particularly good feast on the residual magic, because of the fundamental mistake. Cecilia had forgotten to add the caveat, long learned through years of teaching in order to filter relevant questions. About today's work? Yes, I have a question, said Seamus, looking up instantly. Considering this was the brightest Cecilia had seen the young wizard all lesson, she replied, yes, Mr. Finnegan. Without thinking. I was wondering, Mrs. Frobisher, well, Ron said his mum was looking after your children in the summer. Was this because the ministry took them off you? The room went silent, all eyes on Cecilia, Seamus, and to a lesser extent, Ron. It was Ron who spoke first. Seamus, you idiot, he whispered, as the class looked at him. He stared back at Cecilia. She looked at Ron. He seemed to be blushing almost purple, and Cecilia wondered vaguely whether she should take him to see Madame Pomfrey. Why would Ron say that to Seamus? It was obvious he had interpreted the last part about the ministry. Ludicrous questions like that had tried to come her way all week, most of which she had managed to field or disarm. But children? She glanced back at Ron, then across to Hermione and Harry. The looks on their faces told it all. Ron had had to lie for her at some stage. That's incorrect, Mr. Finnegan. Mrs. Weasley is of course caring for my children while I am here, teaching Mole studies. Then why began Neville, but was silenced by Harry, nudging him sharply in the ribs. Now, if there's any more question regarding today's work, now's your time to ask. No? She added, when no one spoke. In that case, your homework for next week, compare the mole sayings we were talking about last lesson to those used by wizards, with justifications. Enjoy your weekend. The class quickly escaped, grabbing a homework sheet from the pile at the back. However, before he went, she gestured to Ron. He glanced at Harry and Hermione, shrugging as they left. Now, first things first, she began, as Hermione closed the door behind her. About the children thing. I expect that you had to do some quick thinking on my behalf, so thank you. In addition, I have been impressed by your work over the past few weeks, Ron. Your understanding has been exact. You really show talent in science. But I have to ask you, is there anything bothering you at all? Anything about the way I teach you? She waited for Ron to speak, but he shook his head and looked down. I have something for you. It's something that I was given many years ago, an encyclopedia of scientists. It's quite old, but I consider it worthy for a student of your caliber. Ron took the book and looked at it, glancing at the cover, and turned over to the title page. This is really difficult, thought Cecilia, having a one-way dialogue. I will understand, though if you do not wish to accept it, she continued, and I'll provide another book of your choice in its place, if you prefer. Ron looked up sharply. No, Mrs. Frobisher, thank you, he said, a look of amazement on his face. This is Blue Super, thank you. You're welcome, said Cecilia. Finally. And it only took old Harris's book to do it. He'd have had a fit if he'd known she'd given it to a student, though. Mrs. Frobisher, continued Ron, still looking down at the book. About my work. Cecilia waited for him to finish. Is it as good, is it better than Hermione's? It was almost a whisper, and she nearly didn't catch it. Ron, I'd have been proud if a Mole student had produced half of what you've done. Your work is insightful and astute, you show clear understanding. She paused. Hogwarts wasn't like Mole schools. The students here were used to working to the task in an old grammar school way, rather than the tasks working to suit them. Ron would not have understood if she tried to explain that the gains he had made in such a short time for himself were far more impressive than those Hermione had achieved. "Yes, it's better than Hermione's," she said, smiling slightly. It wasn't a lie, she reassured herself. Just an interpretation of the truth. However, it is not very professional of me to say so to you, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention it to her. "Thanks, Mrs. Frobisher," he said, delighted. He looked at the encyclopedia again. "And thanks for this too," he said. "Have a good weekend, Ron," she said, signaling their conversation as at an end, and turned to collect the books up from the lesson. "Thanks for the advice. I'll be sure to consider everything you said." Cecilia looked up sharply. "What advice?" she began, but Ron had left. 88,888,888. As she reached her room, Cecilia pondered the week. Patience wasn't really in her nature, and waiting for a response from Nick was like waiting for exam results. She tried to push it to the back of her mind and stop speculating about what he would say, what date he would arrange, even if she could come at all, but questions filtered through from the unused part of her mind. Brushing her hair out as she thought, she wondered how long it would be until she heard from him when Snape walked through the door, without knocking. "What the hey!" exclaimed Cecilia, as he strode in. She stood up and put her hands on her hips. "I could have been getting dressed, you know," she said, in tones of indignation, wagging her hairbrush in his direction. "You could have knocked." Ignoring her, he handed her 2 letters. "For you," he said simply, sitting down on the chair near the door. "Looks like one from your friend." Cecilia glanced back at Snape quickly, then undid it. She scanned the note. "Well?" said Snape, after a time. "Is it from him?" "Yes," said Cecilia vaguely, scanning the letter again. It was quite simple, Nick's usual style, bloke-like and to the point. She looked up. "He's arranged for the lab to be free on 30th October, a Monday morning. It's a half-staff day, which means he'll be alone covering the night shift from the Sunday. We'll have to be there about 4 in the morning." "Not we," said Snape. "You know I can't be with you, Cecilia," he reminded her. "No, I meant we as in me, and the Order member. Do you know who it might be? Professor Dumbledore said he would mention it at the meeting." "No," replied Snape, getting up. "I don't know. But, as Professor Dumbledore said, he or they will be in touch. Do not concern yourself, Cecilia, there are things you can trust to be arranged without you." Cecilia gave him a sharp look, but he seemed oblivious to it. "What I think we should prepare is everything we've spoken about so far and try to further our understanding." Cecilia had already prepared a list of things they should discuss, including the mystery of Raymond Lully, and the obtaining of hair samples. She nodded. "Have you got all of the samples yet? It would be good to do some preliminary tests on them. We've got plenty of time before 30th. "Not all, yet, but I'll bring what I have. You have Potter's, I trust. Your meeting last night went well, I presume?" Cecilia stopped. She'd forgotten about the fact she had to get some hair from Harry. When she'd cancelled their meeting and postponed it to the following Monday, it had entirely slipped her mind. "We rearranged for Monday," she said, a little sheepishly at her own shortcomings in light of what probably looked like her pushing Snape. "I intended to ask him this evening, however," she added. "Good," he intoned, nodding slightly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll see you tomorrow evening," said Snape, as Cecilia glanced down at the letter again. She looked back up. There was no way in the world you could give Severus Snape only half your attention. "Yes," Cecilia said again. "Any particular time? I think it'd be important to arrange it when you don't need to go away for your order work." She stopped. It hadn't meant to come out that way. All she'd meant to say was that it would be beneficial with no interruptions. She stared back at Snape, brazening it out. "The afternoon," he said, and Cecilia felt sure his tone had become a little colder. She nodded, as he strode out. Cecilia stood there for a few moments, before turning her attention back to Nick's letter. Finally, she thought, after everything that's happened this week. The proposal to Snape and Dumbledore couldn't have gone better, she thought, considering their meeting. Nick had written back and she was going home. Home. She thought how funny it must have looked to Nick when he'd received her letter. That it had seemingly been dropped on his doorstep rather than posted through the letterbox would have been strange, she thought. But what about her request to address it to Mrs. Cecilia Frobisher, CO the Patent Office, Teachers' Quarters, Department of Science and Magical Research? That was the thing, wasn't it? The reason why the plan was so good. She, Jamie Murray and Nick Smith had spent almost 2 years devising devilishly silly practical jokes to play on other people or each other that he would just assume this was another. She nodded, throwing the letters onto the desk, and pulling on some fresh clothes. Just a matter of talking to Harry now, she thought, and then I'm done. Taking 2 steps outside her door, she stopped. Snape had given her 2 letters, hadn't he? Curiosity getting the better of her, she went back inside, and closed the door, pacing towards her desk. The letter was underneath the one from Nick, discarded just moments ago. The envelope was quite plain, bearing just her name in neat, but old-fashioned script, which looked very familiar. Quickly she tore through the envelope. A letter, folded neatly, fell into her hand, and she unfurled it quickly. Cecilia. I trust your return to Hogwarts was both discreet and safe. The passage under the school is a very old secret and as such, only the most talented troublemakers know of its existence. Professor Dumbledore spoke about your plan on Tuesday evening, the last Order meeting, and although nothing is settled, Tonks will probably accompany you. In fact, she appeared very keen to do so. She mentioned to me that you'd spoken of my relative, Lolly. Unfortunately I do not have any more information other than what you already know, from Harry's letter, and I am not familiar with the term reciprocator. Should I discover more, I will indeed inform you. Considering your comments about my honorable actions to ensure your safety, I have not contacted you by flu. However, should you wish to talk to me, check your fireplace at 8 o'clock on Saturday. This should give you plenty of time to be appropriately attired. Please reply by return of owl if this is acceptable. With kindest regards. Sirius. Cecilia read the letter through twice. Her first impression was with the formality of the letter. It was almost aristocratic in its manner, carefully informing her and politeness, but underneath, the whole character of the man was revealed. But to what end? Well, Mr. Black, she thought, as she folded it back up again. A talk with you would indeed be very nice. But you'd better be prepared for the fact that I'm not about to get into anything that's not connected to work. Proceeding to her bottom drawer, she placed the letter next to his hair inside Magic and Moles and pulled out a piece of parchment. Two can play at that game, she thought. Sirius, she wrote, thank you for your letter. The effort that you have gone to in obtaining the information I require is most kind. 8 o'clock tomorrow is most acceptable. This should give you plenty of time to be properly attired also. Cecilia. Tying a piece of ribbon around the parchment and addressing the front of it, she stowed the reply in her pocket and made her way towards the Gryffindor common room. 88,888,888. Ron and Harry sat near one of the fires in the Gryffindor common room, a game of wizard chess well underway. Quite unusually, the common room was almost deserted. Most of the young wizards were either at the library collecting books for work or upstairs in the bedrooms, tackling what Hermione called autumn work shock. The Weasley twins sat on one of the sofas reading a textbook each, near enough to hear what they were saying, but far enough away not to interfere. Unusually too, the boys were discussing work. Maybe the expression, raining cats and dogs, did originate from actual cats and dogs, said Ron, thoughtfully, as he moved a pawn diagonally to take one of Harry's. A crack of stone indicated the pawn had been well and truly been decimated. Perhaps some wizard had a bit of a laugh at some mole's expense and decided to play joke. You know, Ron, ever since Mrs. Frobisher gave you that book about scientists, you haven't shut up about moles. Harry gazed thoughtfully at the board. Yes, Ron, said Ginny, who appeared out of nowhere. Well, just one particular mole, anyway. She ignored the evil stare from her brother. I've always been interested because of Dad, actually, said Ron defensively. And I don't know what you're going on about. You don't actually like her, Ginny. Come on, said Harry, intent on teasing his friend a little more. You're telling me your avid interest in all things mole isn't at least in part to our dear mole studies teacher? Ron averted his stare from Ginny to Harry, and began to turn red. Well, he began. She's made me see there's more to life than just wizards and magic in our world. Hey, he said, as Ginny nudged Harry, teasing her brother. What's this? Said Fred, as he and George came over to join the conversation. Something to do with Mrs. Frobisher? I think it's Ron's mad obsession with her, personally, said George. It's a shame you find speaking to her so difficult, oh brother dearest. In order to make a successful relationship, you need to be able to talk, said Fred, knowledgeably. Anyway, said Ginny, scowling at her brothers, I need to speak to you, Harry. Okay? He said, looking back at Ron. No, confidentially, she said, scowling at her brothers. It's about something I heard. But there's no one else here, Ginny, said Ron, and besides, Harry will just tell me, anyway. He smiled at Harry, who grinned back. He's right, Ginny. You can tell all of us. All right, she said, sitting down next to Ron. Fred and George hurriedly sat on the floor near the fire, crossing their legs as much as to say, we're going nowhere. Lavender Brown overheard Draco bragging last night about Mrs. Frobisher. Apparently he was telling Pansy Parkinson how he had found out single-handedly that she was a squib, and in the library last Saturday, apparently, he and Crabbe and Goyle called her some pretty horrible names. But he can't have done, said Harry, frowning. She was in the corridor near the main hall. She'd just come from the library and said she'd been looking for us to cancel our meeting for Thursday night. Right, said Ron, nodding in agreement. And you said that it'd be fine because you wanted to get some more Quidditch practice in. Then she took me to one side and talked to me about her book. He finished, holding up the Encyclopedia of Scientists. Do you think Malfoy might have been lying? Said Harry, looking at Ginny. She definitely spoke to us. I don't think so, she said. He said he had her by one point, and wanted to see her fake wand. He said that? Malfoy. How on earth can he still think squibs still carry one? Fred glanced at his brother. Well, Filch had his, don't you remember, when we managed to get into the George stopped, aware that he was holding a conversation with his brother in public. Never mind that, said Harry. He must have been bragging. He wouldn't have dared to rough up a teacher, even one he thought was a squib. I don't know, Harry, said Ron uncertainly. Squibs used to be pretty much hated not so long ago. They did used to have to carry fake wands, and they had to have badges if they were stopped. He looked at the twins, who nodded in confirmation. It was even like Seamus said today that squibs had their children taken off them. That's awful, said Ginny, shaking her head. It's no wonder Malfoy's been like he has. And encouraging the rest of Slytherin to do it too, said George. At least she liked our newspaper, eh? He said, and Fred grinned. So Malfoy's lying, then, said Harry. No, insisted Ginny. She had to have been in the library. According to him, the only thing stopping him from making his father proud was that Snape found them and made them go to bed. Making his father proud, said Ron, in disgust. Is that what he calls it? When I get my hands on him I'll... He banged his fist on the chessboard, making the pieces fly up into the air. Some of the major pieces called out in protest. Ah, young love, said George, as they all laughed at Ron. He hung his head slightly, going even redder. It'll never work, said Ginny, laughing. According to Malfoy, the only reason Snape stopped him from revealing she was a squib was because fancies her. So you've got no chance. Well, that can't be right, anyway, said Harry. Snape knows she's a mole, so the reason he defended her was because of the research. But I wouldn't put it past Snape. I mean, yuck, can you imagine it? Being the object of Snape's affection? George mimicked Cecilia running away in horror, hands raised as Fred pretended to be Snape, in pursuit. Even if he does, continued Harry, I don't think she feels the same. I mean, who would? Well, yuck. Yes, but how much do we really know about her? Said Ginny. There's definitely something more to her and meets the eye. You're just saying that because you don't like her, said Ron, accusingly. Don't like who? Said Neville, walking towards them. No one spoke. Oh, never mind, he said, defeated. Harry, he said, looking at the scattered chess pieces, then at Harry. Mrs. Frobisher's outside to see you. Something to do with extension work. She had a bit of trouble trying to get past the fat lady. I said I'd tell you she was waiting. Ginny gave Harry a wide-eyed stare, as he got to his feet. See you later, guys, he said, walking towards the door. Neville, said Ron. You don't think I'm obsessed with moles, do you? He said, arm round his classmate, walking him over to the sofa. I mean, you know, reading the book that Mrs. Frobisher gave me, for my outstanding work, had made me realize. Ginny rolled her eyes for effect and her brothers guffawed with laughter. Ron on his favorite subject, I hear? Said Hermione, who had appeared in the common room moments after Neville. Ginny nodded. I was just saying to Harry, Malfoy reckons Snape fancies her, added George. But I think she'd sooner fall for Fluffy than Snape. Fred grinned. They do look pretty close, though, added Ginny, getting up. I wouldn't wonder. Ginny, said Hermione, sharply. This is the 20th century, for heaven's sake. Men and women can work with each other and get on without anything else getting in the way, you know. That's what being grown up is all about, isn't it? And you know this, how exactly, Hermione? Said Fred, nudging George. It's just obvious, isn't it? And she's a teacher. Just jealous because you fancy Snape yourself, eh? Fred winked at George. Hermione shook her head in annoyance. You could have asked her yourself, Ginny, before she took your beloved Harry off just now. He's not my beloved Harry, began Ginny, blushing almost as red as Ron had a few minutes before. Don't know what anyone would see in her anyway, she added, plain as the day is long. Ginny, said Hermione, frowning, then added she was here just now? Ginny nodded. Damn. There was something I was meaning to ask her about the homework she set us, she continued, getting back to her feet. I'll try and catch her in her room. Hermione, you're the only student I know who would go and disturb teachers after school, said George. About work, that is, he added, grinning at Fred. Well, all I'm saying is there's something fishy going on, said Ginny. I think we should keep an eye on her for Harry's sake. And I think we should leave her alone, said Hermione, admonishingly. She's here for many reasons, Ginny, not just through choice. Look what she's been through already. I bet this week's been no picnic either. Hermione's right, said George, sagely. She looked done in on Monday. And today she looked even worse, agreed Fred, nodding toward his sister. But I think we should be keeping an eye on her. I wouldn't like to be on the wrong side of Malfoy if I were a mole. 88,888,888. 2 hours later Cecilia returned to her room. Having been unable to negotiate her way past the fat lady, she bumped into Neville, who had directed Harry out to see her. Proceeding to the Mole Studies classroom, she'd explained the significance of a hair sample. Harry had seemed willing to give her some hair, lopping off a great chunk of it there and then. He'd been less than enthusiastic when she'd mentioned his aunt, however, and had actually asked Cecilia not to contact her. She'd explained that Dumbledore was going to sort it out, though a sample was still necessary. Harry had not seemed pleased at the prospect, and had gone away quickly, mentioning Quidditch practice. Cecilia knew she'd overstepped the mark. She'd told Dumbledore that he was perfectly willing to assist her, even in complicated and difficult tasks, and she'd felt remorse for bringing up a subject that he felt uneasy about. Nevertheless, she needed permission herself, she thought, before she continued as she paced back from the owlery. She hadn't been able to find the owl Sirius had sent her letter with, so she commandeered one of the school owls, avoiding its beak as it tried to object being awoken from a comfortable doze. Considering the aftermath of her reply to Sirius, she turned the knob on the door to her room, and her thoughts were prematurely and terminally abandoned when she surveyed it. The scene was like the day after a Michael Fish weather forecast. It was as if a hurricane had lifted every item of furniture, book, clothing, everything into a huge pile into the middle of the floor. Glass lay scattered around, in big shards and small pulverized mounds. Books too lay open, spines cracked as if they had been trodden on, and she could see sheets had been torn from their bindings and scattered all over the place. A thermometer lay discarded near the foot of her bed. Mercury oozed from a broken end, seeping onto one of her sweaters and down towards the fireplace. In amongst the debris, almost hidden except where a small pile of textbooks was heaving periodically, was Dobby. He stared back at Cecilia, wide-eyed. "Dobby?" Cecilia ventured, as calmly as she could manage, casting her eyes over the place again. "What happened here, Dobby?" The house elf simply stared back at her, whimpering. "Dobby," she said, more forcefully, though feeling herself shaken she could feel the color drain from her face. She let go of the handle, and the door banged against the wall. "Mrs. Frobisher?" "Mrs. Frobisher, aye." Cecilia turned to see Hermione behind her. The girl looked at Cecilia and past her, at the room, complete with her belongings in utter disarray and Dobby sitting amongst it all. "I'll go and get someone," said Hermione, almost under her breath. Cecilia looked at her go dumbly, before turning to her room again. How on earth had this happened? Had Dobby had an accident? Cecilia stooped to pick up one of the books near to her, and folded back the pages. It was one of her Mole Studies books. Most of the pages had been ripped at the spine, so they hung loosely down. The last page, which was being updated with the information from obviously this evening's state opening of Parliament, continued to imprint itself on the page, but with far less clarity and vibrancy as the writing had been before. She looked across at her desk. The drawers had been wrenched out of their runners, and there seemed to be scorch marks round the lock at the front. The bottom drawer was upside down, its contents spilled every which way. Cecilia made her way with difficulty across her belongings, looking for the two books that were the most valuable to the research. When she couldn't find them, she started pulling things around her up in the air, getting more and more anxious. "Where are they, Dobby?" said Cecilia, frantically to the house elf. When he didn't reply, she stopped searching, and made her way across to him. "Dobby," she said, almost shouting at him. "The books. Where are they?" "Lady," said Dobby, a mournful warble coming from his little mouth. Dobby just arrived. Dobby came to find Lady. Dobby didn't do this, he wailed, wincing as Cecilia sporadically searched for what was missing. After a couple of minutes randomly pulling things up and throwing them down, she finally stopped, picking up Magic and Mel's. The leather cover had been torn back to the board, the fabric looking very sorry for itself in her hand. Still on her knees, Cecilia bent over it, tears she could no longer contain erupting in sobs as she cradled the book in her arms. She didn't realize the moment when Professor McGonagall was kneeling beside her, trying to comfort her. She felt her sobs subsiding when she realized Minerva was speaking to her softly that everything would be all right, and helped her to her feet. "Just stand there for a moment, my dear," she said, positioning Cecilia near the fireplace. "I cannot say for sure who has done this, but I have a fair idea. Miss Granger," she said, beckoning to Hermione, who was lurking by the door. "Take this house elf to Professor Dumbledore at once. The password is pumpkin juice. Go. At once," she insisted, pushing Dobby towards the awestruck Hermione. "Now," she continued, in a softer voice, "let's get this place tidied up as it was, shall we?" Cecilia nodded silently, as Minerva withdrew her wand from her robes. "Reparo," she said, almost randomly to Cecilia, her heart becoming less fraught as her belongings pieced themselves before her eyes. Once Minerva had finished, she took her hand and sat her down. "There," she said when every last item was repaired. "Good as new," she added, looking closely at Cecilia as she looked through the pile of books that had stacked themselves upon her desk. "It's gone," said Cecilia eventually. "Mysterious Mythology. It was in the bottom drawer with Magic and Mel's." She paused as she opened the back of the book. Sirius's hair was back where she'd left it, as was the letter. "Mysterious Mythology, Minerva." She began again. "Remus's book. It's gone. And it will be recovered," said Professor McGonagall. "I assure you whoever did this, the culprits will be found. Please do nothing yourself. Now," she said, sitting on Cecilia's now-made bed. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" Cecilia sat next to her. "Well," she began, "I'd just got back from talking to Harry about the hair samples," she began, but Minerva hushed her up. "No, the beginning," she clarified. "From last Saturday. With Malfoy." Cecilia sighed. She'd done a good job, she'd considered, coping with it all. "Severus?" said Minerva, when she'd finished. "Severus knew about this." Cecilia thought she detected a faint note of annoyance in her voice. "It doesn't matter now, Cecilia. After tonight, Professor Dumbledore will deal with this." "But the book," insisted Cecilia. "Will be recovered," said Minerva, patiently. "Now, aside from this, how are you feeling about everything?" Cecilia paused. "Not too bad, under the circumstances," she thought. "I'm missing home," she said lamely. It was the first comprehensible thought that came into her mind. "It's not like I've not fitted in here though. We're progressing with the work. But I'm missing." "Tim?" finished Minerva. "This surely doesn't help. Why did you tell those students you were a squib, Cecilia?" "I didn't," she said, wondering how on earth Minerva could possibly know how she felt. And put it so succinctly. Draco seemed to know. "It was my backup plan, but he approached me with it. I thought it sensible to play along." "That is one of the many things for which Wizardkind ought to be ashamed of itself," said Minerva, patting her hand. "Children, born to our own kind, outcast in our society, for the single reason that they cannot perform magic. The work you are doing, Cecilia, will inadvertently help them, despite your having to play a certain role. Don't think for 1 minute that the students are wasting their time in Mole studies with you. That you went in every day this week to teach them means they are closer to centuries-old traditions being wiped away. You should be proud of that." Cecilia nodded. However, I believe there are still things of which you need to be aware. Albus believes you have enough to deal with, even more so after tonight, I fear. However, as a member of the stronger gender, you are made of sterner stuff than any man can understand. Cecilia nodded again. Of course she wasn't going to let a little rat like Draco Malfoy break her spirit. But how she began. What I need from you in order for this to work is your trust. Do you trust me, Cecilia? Yes, she said. Then look. Cecilia watched as what appeared to be a silver ribbon emanate from Minerva's head, as she held her wand aloft. Carefully, she brought it down into a pool between them. The consistency seemed to Cecilia like smoke, though it was not opaque, and, the harder she looked, the more there seemed to be a dark green blur. She looked harder, leaning further in out of curiosity. The blur looked to her like it was a tree. The branches seemed to be coming closer to Cecilia the further down she looked. She looked further still, and clenched her fists as the pool enveloped her. She could see the ground as the air rushed around her. She was surely going to hit the great tarmac below her. Suddenly, almost as she thought the end was nigh, she stopped falling, and glided to a graceful swoop, landing feet first. Cecilia looked around her. She appeared to be standing on the tarmac of a path now, and ahead of her, dark, lush fields. Taking in the scenery, it suddenly dawned on her. She was standing not very far away from the Quidditch pitches, inside the grounds of Hogwarts. In front of her were the tall hedges that surrounded the south wall, and to her left, the path led off to Hagrid's hut. Cecilia was about to turn left, when she froze. A boy was heading towards her. He didn't look like any of the Hogwarts students she recognized. His face was long and slimish, mousy hair topped his head, which was slightly long at the back. Not a boy actually, she thought, noticing traces of a beard as he approached. More a young man. Just then she realized that this young man was about to walk into her, and she made to move. As she did so, a voice called out, "Moony! Quick! The McGonagall!" She stopped. "Not here, Prongs, it's fine," he called back. "Just a few leaves." Cecilia stopped. Moony ... the fair hair ... that rich-toned but soft voice ... Remus. Just as she was adjusting to the realization, Harry stepped out from the side of the castle, arm in arm with a young lady. But ... it wasn't Harry. It was a young man that looked very like him, though. He appeared older than Harry too, and had different color eyes. The young lady with him smiled as they approached Remus. Cecilia could feel the evening breeze on her skin that blew their hair. "Thank Hades for that," said the young man who looked like Harry. "I thought we were done in there for sure. Where's Padfoot?" "Here," said Sirius, strolling up the path. Cecilia paused again, taking in his features. My word, he was handsome, she thought, looking him up and down. And he knows it too, she thought, taking in his leather trousers and slicked back black hair. And the charisma, he practically sparkled with sex appeal. Other than the fact it was about 20 years ago, Cecilia considered, he hadn't changed much at all. "Been seeing Henrietta back," he said casually. "Old Snivellus has been sniffing round her again. I reckon the Git's been following us and letting on to the McGonagall." "Git," agreed the young lady with the young man who looked like Harry, in a not very ladylike way. "You know, I worry about her," continued Sirius, nudging Remus. "She said she actually felt sorry for the slimy greaseball." "She has a point," said the girl, glancing up at the Harry-alike, whose hand she was still holding. "He is a very wretched creature." "A very dangerous creature," sniffed not Harry, smiling back. "Never," said Remus, moving towards them. "He might be, well, Snivellus, but I don't believe he'd harm anyone." "Not him," said Sirius, in a causal way, "but the DFs. He wants to join them, you know. Bet he'd do anything, too." Git, agreed the young man who looked like Harry but wasn't. The what? The girl looked questioningly at the lads. The DFs. You know, Lils, Malfoy, Lestrange, McNair, Crabbe, Goyle. Dark followers, they call themselves. Very much interested in. Remus coughed uncertainly and, as he glanced across at Sirius, Cecilia thought she could detect a sense of unease from the young Remus Lupin, and she had an overwhelming urge to find out the problem. Well, we'd better move unless we want to be caught by the old girl, continued Sirius. She's one strict pussycat, the McGonagall, when she's angry. Thank you for that observation, Mr. Black. Cecilia heard a voice. No. Minerva's voice coming from the floor, and she watched in amazement as a tabby cat that Cecilia had failed to notice up to that point changed into the witch, albeit a slightly younger version of herself before her very eyes. Her hair was slightly less grey, and her face less lined, but she wore almost the same clothes she always did, her hair pulled back tightly off her face. That's Professor McGonagall, she added. Fear and trepidation filled the eyes of the four young students in front of her as Minerva beheld them, eyeing them critically. And less of the old girl, she added firmly, as she surveyed them. Miss Evans. She continued. The young lady who had been holding Harry S. No, not Harry's hand. For dear life a few moments ago was standing almost a foot apart, looking down. No, Miss Edwards. Silence. Mr. Black? She turned her attention on Sirius. His face fell slightly, though Cecilia thought she could still detect a hint of a smirk. Perhaps you can enlighten me? She must be in bed, Sirius remarked. She's not with us, he added, glancing sideways at Remus. Yes, that I can see perfectly well, she said reprovingly. However, I have it on good authority that when Miss Edwards cannot be found is to you, Mr. Black, whom I should be speaking. She is not where she should be. Minerva surveyed them again, a slight shrill tone to her voice. And neither are you. And neither shall I subject my intelligence to be insulted by another insolent remark of yours, Mr. Black. I wouldn't dare, Professor. Not your intelligence, grinned Sirius, half under his breath. Professor McGonagall chose to ignore him. And I thought you, Miss Evans, and you, Mr. Lupin, as head girl and head boy, would have a more superior sense of duty than to break the rules and be out of bed after hours. I realize it's your final year, and I realize you've sat your newts, but that is no excuse. She exhaled deliberately, expressing her exasperation. On this occasion, I will allow it to pass. However, she added, eyeing the four students in front of her, who had chosen to express their victory too soon. If I should catch you marauding around the castle or grounds after hours again, your feet won't touch the ground. And I know Professor Gibbons has plenty of first year's cauldrons that need a good clean. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Professor, they said in unison. They all trooped past her, back into the castle. As Sirius passed, Minerva called him back. Mr. Black, she repeated, when the other students had gone. There is no point in lying to me, as I know for a fact that Miss Edwards was with you this evening. It is in your best interest to tell me the truth. Cecilia could see the bravado had gone now. The expression that she had witnessed almost a week ago, of almost vulnerability, replaced the swaggering self-assured Sirius of moments ago. Yes, Professor. That is all I need to know at present. When did you last see her? I walked her back to the girls' dorm about half an hour ago. What's the matter, Professor? Listen to me, Black. It is vital that you do not repeat what I am about to tell you to anyone, not even Potter. Do you understand me? Instead of replying, Cecilia noticed how the young Sirius just stopped talking. We have just had word. The headmaster has just had word. Mr. and Mrs. Edwards were killed at their home tonight. They were murdered by wizard or wizards unknown. Do you understand me, Black? When he didn't answer, Minerva grabbed him by the shoulders. Do you understand me? Sirius nodded, frantically. But, what has this got to do with me? He frowned at Minerva in the effort of comprehension. Whoever it was who murdered Mr. and Mrs. Edwards were looking for Henrietta. Because she is a mole-born. Sirius looked at her. Git. He said finally, spitting the word at the floor, the bloody git. It's him, Professor, the bloody slimy git. He's got her. Snivellus. He tried to get past Minerva again, but was held fast. If you are talking about Mr. Snape, it was he who informed myself that she was missing. I can't see your point if you go to the Shrieking Shack if you don't believe me, shouted Sirius, frantically. That's where he'll be, with the other Slytherin gits. Without realizing it, Cecilia was drifting slowly away from the scene. Minerva McGonagall trying to extract information from the frantic Sirius Black faded to a mist, and their conversation to a whisper as she left the scene. Almost immediately she found herself somewhere else. She had been here before, she knew it. Those books. They were in the same position as the ones in Dumbledore's office. This time, Cecilia knew what to expect. She looked round at the people around her except Dumbledore. He was very much different to how Cecilia knew him. His features were the same, down to his spectacles. But instead of his long, white beard and flowing white locks, his hair was brown, much shorter, and his beard was pointed. Before him stood Sirius, who Cecilia has just seen debating the odds with Minerva. Next to him, another student, tall and thin. She did not recognize him. It wasn't a student who had been one of the marauders. However, he did look in part familiar, but apart from the grave expression on a fresh-faced, adolescent face, there was very little that distinguished him. It looks to me very much like a case of unjustified assault, Mr. Black, Dumbledore said, gravely. And as you were outside school grounds and not yet of age, there is absolutely no reason why Mr. Snape should not press charges with the Ministry. The young wizard next to Sirius turned slightly, his long hair moving as he turned his head. Mr. Snape. Looking carefully, Cecilia recognized that half-smile. But the boy Severus seemed so young. He turned his head slightly towards Dumbledore, but when his hair moved it wasn't the sallow features of the Severus Snape she knew. The boy, young man, looked youthful. As full of life as any seventh-year student. Cecilia stopped examining his face as he coughed, and began to speak. Professor, if I may, I believe Sirius was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. He misinterpreted something as something else, and acted on his instincts. He swallowed, and coughed again before continuing silkily. I believe it would be quite wrong of me to prosecute him when it was clearly a case of mistaking my actions with Miss Edwards. Especially when the Ministry are looking for his brother. Dumbledore gave Severus a quick look, before stepping between the two students as Sirius lunged at Snape.